Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects by Giorgio Vasari.
Life of Michelangelo Buonarroti, Part 6.
Michelangelo loved his fellow craftsmen and held intercourse with them, as with Jacopo Sansovino, Rosso, Pontormo, Daniele da Volterra, and Giorgio Vasari of Arezzo, to which last he showed innumerable kindnesses, and he was the reason that Giorgio gave his attention to architecture, intending to make use of him some day, and he readily conferred and discussed matters of art with him. Those who say that he was not willing to teach are wrong, because he was always willing with his intimates and with anyone who asked him for counsel, and I have been present on many such occasions, but of these, out of consideration, I say nothing, not wishing to reveal the deficiencies of others. It may be urged that he had bad fortune with those who lived with him in his house, which was because he hit upon natures little able to imitate him. Thus, Pietro Urbano of Pistoia, his pupil, was a man of parts, but would never exert himself. Antonio Meni was willing, but had no aptitude of brain, and when the wax is hard, it does not readily take an impression. Ascanio dalla Rippa Transoni took great pains, but of this no fruits were ever seen, either in designs or in finished works, and he toiled several years over a picture for which Michelangelo had given him a cartoon. In the end, all the good expectation in which he was held vanished in smoke, and I remember that Michelangelo would be seized with compassion for his toil, and would assist him with his own hand, but this profited him little. If he had found a nature after his heart, as he told me several times, in spite of his age he would often have made anatomical studies, and would have written upon them, for the benefit of his fellow craftsmen, for he was disappointed by several. But he did not trust himself, through not being able to express himself in writing as he would have liked, because he was not practiced in diction, although in the prose of his letters he explained his conceptions very well, in a few words. He much delighted in readings of the poets in the vulgar tongue, and particularly of Dante, whom he much admired, imitating him in his conceptions and inventions, and so with Petrarca, having delighted to make madrigals and sonnets of great weight, upon which commentaries have been written. Monsieur Benedetto Varchi gave a lecture in the Florentine Academy upon that sonnet, which begins, Non ha Latino artista alcun concetto, ch'un marmoc solo in si non circumscriva. Michelangelo sent a vast number by his own hand, receiving answers in rhyme and in prose, to the most illustrious Marchioness of Pescara, of whose virtues he was enamored, and she likewise of his, and she went many times to Rome from Viterbo to visit him, and Michelangelo designed for her a dead Christ in the lap of Our Lady, with two little angels, all most admirable, and a Christ fixed on the cross, who, with the head uplifted, is recommending his spirit to the Father, a divine work, and also a Christ with the woman of Samaria at the well. He much delighted in the sacred scriptures, like the excellent Christian that he was, and he held in great veneration the works written by Fra Girolamo Savonarola, because he had heard the voice of that friar in the pulpit. He greatly loved human beauty for the sake of imitation in art, being able to select from the beautiful the most beautiful, for without this imitation no perfect work can be done, but not with lasciviousness and disgraceful thoughts, as he proved by his way of life, which was very frugal. Thus, when he was young, all intent on his work, he contented himself with a little bread and wine, and this he continued when old, until the time when he was painting the Judgment in the chapel, taking his refreshment in the evening when he had finished the day's work, but always very frugally. And although he was rich, he lived like a poor man, nor did any friend ever eat at his table, or rarely, and he would not accept presents from anyone, because it appeared to him that if anyone gave him something, he would be bound to him forever. This sober life kept him very active, and in want of very little sleep. And often during the night, not being able to sleep, he would rise to labor with the chisel. Having made a cap of thick paper, and over the center of his head he kept a lighted candle, which in this way threw light over where he was working without encumbering his hands. Vasari, who had seen the cap several times, reflected that he did not use wax, but candles of pure goat's tallow, which are excellent, sent him 4 bundles of these, which weighed 40 libra, and his servant, with all courtesy, carried them to him at the 2nd hour of the evening, and presented them to him. But Michelangelo refused them, declaring that he did not want them, and then the servant said, "They have broken my arms on the way between the bridge and here, and I shall not carry them back to the house. Now here, in front of your door, there is a solid heap of mud. They will stand in it beautifully, and I will set them all alight." Michelangelo said to him, "Put them down here, for I will not have you playing pranks at my door." He told me that often in his youth he slept in his clothes, being weary with labor, and not caring to take them off, only to have to put them on again later. There are some who have taxed him with being avaricious, but they are mistaken, for both with works of art and with his substance, he proved the contrary. Of works of art, as has been seen and related, he presented to Monsieur Tommaso di Cavalieri, to Messer Bindo, and to Fra Sebastiano, designs of considerable value, and to Antonio Mini, his pupil, all his designs, all his cartoons, and the picture of the leader, and all the models in clay and wax that he ever made, which, as has been related, were all left in France. To Corrado Perini, a Florentine gentleman who was very much his friend, he gave 3 sheets with some divine heads in black chalk, which since Perini's death have come into the hands of the most illustrious Don Francesco, Prince of Florence, who treasures them as jewels, as indeed they are. For Bartolomeo Bettini, he made a cartoon, which he presented to him, of a Venus with a Cupid that is kissing her, a divine thing which is now in the possession of Bettini's heirs in Florence. And for the Marchesa del Vasto, he made a cartoon of a Noli Me Tangere, a rare thing, and these 2 last were painted excellently well by Portomo, as has been related. He presented the 2 captives to Signor Roberto Strozzi, and the Pietà in marble, which he broke to Antonio, his servant, and to Francesca Fantini. I know not, therefore, how this man can be taxed with avarice, he having given away so many things for which he could have obtained thousands of crowns. What better proof can I give than this, that I know from personal experience that he made many designs and went to see many pictures and buildings without demanding any payment? But let us come to the money earned by him by the sweat of his brow, not from revenues, not from traffickings, but from his own study and labor. Can he be called avaricious, who succored many poor persons, as he did, and secretly married off a good number of girls, and enriched those who served him and assisted him in his works, as with his servant Urbino, whom he made a very rich man? This Urbino was his man of all work, and had served him a long time. And Michelangelo said to him, "If I die, what will you do?" And he answered, "I will serve another master." "You poor creature," said Michelangelo, "I will save you from such misery," and presented 2,000 crowns to him in one sum, an act such as is generally left to Caesars and pontiffs. To his nephew, moreover, he gave 3,000 and 4,000 crowns at a time, and at the end he left him 10,000 crowns besides his property in Rome. Michelangelo was a man of tenacious and profound memory, so that, on seeing the works of others only once, he remembered them perfectly, and could avail himself of them in such a manner that scarcely anyone has ever noticed it. Nor did he ever do anything that resembled another thing by his hand, because he remembered everything that he had done. In his youth, being once with his painter friends, they played for a supper for him who should make a figure most completely wanting in design and clumsy, after the likeness of the puppet figures which those make who know nothing, scrawling upon walls, and in this he availed himself of his memory, for he remembered having seen one of those absurdities on a wall, and drew it exactly as if he had had it before him, and thus surpassed all those painters, a thing difficult for a man so steeped in design, and accustomed to choice works, to come out of with credit. He was full of disdain, and rightly, against anyone who did him an injury, but he was never seen to run to take revenge. Nay, rather, he was most patient, modest in all his ways, very prudent and wise in his speech, with answers full of weight, and at times sayings most ingenious, amusing, and acute. He said many things that have been written down by me, of which I shall include only a few, because it would take too long to give them all. A friend having spoken to him of death, saying that it must grieve him much, because he had lived in continual labor in matters of art, and had never had any repose, he answered that all that was nothing, because, if life is a pleasure to us, death, being likewise by the hand of one and the same master, should not displease us. To a citizen who found him by Orson Michel in Florence, where he had stopped to gaze at Donato's statue of St. Mark, and who asked him what he thought of that figure, Michelangelo answered that he had never seen a figure that had more of the air of a good man than that one, and that if St. Mark was like that, one could give credence to what he had written. Being shown the drawing of a boy then beginning to learn to draw, who was recommended to him, some persons excusing him because it was not long since he had applied himself to art, he replied, "That is evident." He said a similar thing to a painter who had painted a Pietà and had not acquitted himself well. It is indeed a pitiful thing to see. Having heard that Sebastiano Vinciano had to paint a friar in the chapel of St. Pietro a Montorio, he said that this would spoil the work for him, and being asked why he said that, he answered, "Since they have spoiled the world, which is so large, it would not be surprising if they was to spoil such a small thing as that chapel." A painter had executed a work with very great pains, toiling over it a long time, but when it was given to view, he had made a considerable profit. Michelangelo was asked what he thought of the craftsman, and he answered, "As long as this man strives to be rich, he will always remain a poor creature." One of his friends, who was a churchman and used formerly to say Mass, having arrived in Rome all covered with points and silk, saluted Michelangelo, but he pretended not to see him, so that the friend was forced to declare his name to him. Michelangelo expressed marvel that he should be in that habit, and then added, as if it were to congratulate him, "Oh, but you are magnificent. If you were as fine within as I see you to be without, it would be well with your soul." The same man had recommended a friend to Michelangelo, who had given him a statue to execute, praying him that he should have something more given to him, which Michelangelo graciously did. But the envy of the friend, who had made the request to Michelangelo only in the belief that he would not grant it, brought it about that, perceiving that the master had granted it after all, he complained of it. This matter was reported to Michelangelo, and he answered that he did not like men made like sowers, using a metaphor from architecture, and meaning that it is difficult to have dealings with men who have two mouths. Being asked by a friend what he thought of one who had counterfeited in marble some of the most celebrated antique figures, and boasted that in his imitations he had surpassed the antiques by a great measure, Michelangelo replied, He who goes behind others can never go in front of them, and he who is not able to work well for himself cannot make good use of the works of others. A certain painter, I know not who, had executed a work wherein was an ox, which looked better than any other part. And Michelangelo, being asked why the painter had made the ox more lifelike than the rest, said, "Any painter can make a good portrait of himself." Passing by St. Giovanni in Florence, he was asked his opinion of those doors, and he answered, "They are so beautiful that they would do well at the gates of paradise." While serving a prince who kept changing plans every day and would never stand firm, Michelangelo said to a friend, "This lord has a brain like a weathercock, which turns round with every wind that blows on it." He went to see a work of sculpture which was about to be sent out because it was finished, and the sculptor was taking much trouble to arrange the lights from the windows, to the end that it might show up well. Whereupon Michelangelo said to him, "Do not trouble yourself. The important thing will be the light of the piazza," meaning to infer that when works are in public places, the people must judge whether they are good or bad. There was a great prince in Rome who had a notion to play the architect, and he had caused certain niches to be built in which to place figures, each 3 squares high, with a ring at the top, and having tried to place various statues within these niches, which did not turn out well, he asked Michelangelo what he should place in them, and he answered, "Hang bunches of eels from those rings." There was appointed to the government of the fabric of St. Pietro a gentleman who professed to understand Vitruvius, and to be a critic of the work done. Michelangelo was told, "You have obtained for the fabric one who has a great intelligence." And he answered, "That is true, but he has a bad judgment." A painter had executed a scene and had copied many things from various other works, both drawings and pictures. Nor was there anything in that work that was not copied. It was shown to Michelangelo, who, having seen it, was asked by a very dear friend what he thought of it, and he replied, "He has done well, but I know not what this scene will do on the day of judgment, when all bodies shall recover their members, for there will be nothing left of it." A warning to those who practice art that they should make a habit of working by themselves. Passing through Medina, he saw many beautiful figures by the hands of Maestro Antonio Bigarini, a sculptor of Medina, made of terracotta and colored in imitation of marble, which appeared to him to be excellent works. And since that sculptor did not know how to work marble, Michelangelo said, "If this clay were to become marble, woe to the ancient statues." Michelangelo was told that he should show resentment against Nanni di Biggio, who was seeking every day to compete with him. But he answered, "He who contends with men of no account never gains a victory." A priest, his friend, said to him, "It is a pity that you have not taken a wife, so that you might have had many children and left them all your honorable labors." And Michelangelo replied, "I have only too much of a wife in this art of mine, who has always kept me in tribulation, and my children shall be the works that I may leave, which, even if they are not, will live a while." Woe to Lorenzo di Bartolito Ghiberti, if he had not made the gates of St. Giovanni, for his children and grandchildren sold or squandered all that he left, but the gates are still standing. Vasari sent by Julius III to Michelangelo's house for a design at the first hour of the night, found him working at the Pietà in marble that he broke. Michelangelo, recognizing him by the knock at the door, left his work and took a lamp with his hand by the handle. Vasari explained what he wanted, whereupon Michelangelo sent Urbino upstairs for the design, and then they entered into another conversation. Meanwhile, Vasari turned his eyes to examine a leg of the Christ, at which he was working, seeking to change it, and in order to prevent Vasari from seeing it, he left the lamp fall from his hand, and they were left in darkness. He called to Urbino to bring a light, and meanwhile came forth from the enclosure where the work was, and said, I am so old that death often pulls me by the cloak, that I may go with him, and one day this body of mine will fall like the lamp, and the light of my life will be spent. For all this, he took pleasure in certain kinds of men after his taste, such as Michelangelo, a commonplace and clownish painter of Valdano, who was a most diverting person. He would come at times to Michelangelo, that he might make for him a design of St. Rocco or St. Anthony, to be painted for peasants, and Michelangelo, who was with difficulty persuaded to work for kings, would deign to set aside all his other work and make him simple designs suited to his manner and his wishes, as Michelangelo himself used to say. Among other things, Michelangelo persuaded him to make a model of a crucifix, which was very beautiful. Of this he made a mold, from which he formed copies in pasteboard and other materials, and these he went about selling throughout the countryside. Michelangelo would burst out laughing at him, particularly because he used to meet with fine adventures, as with a countryman who commissioned him to paint a St. Francis, and was displeased because Michelangelo had made the vestment gray, whereas he would have liked it of a finer color, whereupon Michelangelo painted over the saint's shoulders a pluvial of brocade, and so contented him. He loved likewise the stonecutter Topolino, who had a notion of being an able sculptor, but was in truth very feeble. This man spent many years in the mountains of Carrara, sending marble to Michelangelo, nor would he ever send a boatload without adding 2 or 3 or 4 little figures blocked out with his own hand, at which Michelangelo would die of laughing. Finally Topolino returned, and, having blocked out a Mercury from a piece of marble, he set himself to finish it, and one day, when there was little left to do, he desired that Michelangelo should see it, and straitly besought him that he should tell him his opinion. You are a madman to try to make figures, Topolino, said Michelangelo. Do you not see that your Mercury is more than 1/3 of a braccio too short, between the knees and the feet, and that you have made him a dwarf and all misshapen? Oh, that is nothing. If there is nothing else wrong, I will put it right. Leave it to me. Michelangelo laughed once more at his simplicity, and when he was gone, Topolino took a piece of marble, and having cut the Mercury 1/4 of a braccio below the knees, he let it into the new piece of marble and joined it neatly together, making a pair of buskins for the Mercury, the tops of which were above the joins, and so he added the length required. Then he invited Michelangelo to come and showed him his work once again, and the master laughed, marveling that such simpletons, when driven by necessity, form resolutions of which able men are not capable. While Michelangelo was having a tomb of Julius II finished, he caused a marble hewer to execute a terminal figure for placing in the tomb in St. Pietro in Vincola, saying to him, cut away this today, level that, polish here, insomuch that, without the other noticing it, he enabled him to make a figure. Wherefore, when it was finished, the man gazed at it marveling, and Michelangelo said, what do you think of it? I think it fine, he answered, and I am much obliged to you. Why so? Asked Michelangelo. Because by your means I have discovered a talent that I did not know I possessed. Now, to be brief, I must record that the master's constitution was very sound, but he was lean and well knit together with nerves, and although as a boy he was delicate, and as a man he had 2 serious illnesses, he could always endure any fatigue and had no infirmity, save that in his old age he suffered from dysuria and from gravel, which in the end developed into the stone, wherefore for many years he was syringed by the hand of Maestro Rialto Colombo, his very dear friend, who treated him with great diligence. He was of middle stature, broad in the shoulders, but well proportioned in all the rest of his body. In his latter years he wore buskins of dogskin on the legs, next to the skin, constantly for whole months together, so that afterwards, when he sought to take them off, on drawing them off, the skin often came away with them. Over the stockings he wore boots of cordwain, fastened on the inside as a protection against damp. His face was round, the brow square and spacious, with 7 straight lines, and the temples projected considerably beyond the ears, which ears were somewhat on the large side and stood out from the cheeks. The body was in proportion to the face, or rather on the large side, the nose somewhat flattened, as was said in the life of Torrigiano, who broke it for him with his fist, the eyes rather on the small side, of the color of horn, spotted with bluish and yellowish gleams, the eyebrows with few hairs, the lips thin, with the lower lip rather thicker and projecting a little, the chin well-shaped and in proportion with the rest, the hair black, but mingled with white hairs like the beard, which was not very long, forked, and not very thick. Truly his coming was to the world, as I said at the beginning, an exemplar sent by God to the men of our arts, to the end that they might learn from his life the nature of noble character, and from his works what true and excellent craftsmen ought to be. And I, who have to praise God for infinite blessings, as in seldom wont to happen with men of our profession, count it among the greatest blessings that I was born at the time when Michelangelo was alive, that I was thought worthy to have him as my master, and that he was so much my friend and intimate, as everyone knows, and as the letters written by him to me, now in my possession, bear witness, and out of love for truth, and also from the obligation that I feel to his loving kindness, I have contrived to write many things of him, and all true, which many others have not been able to do. Another blessing he used to point out to me himself. You should thank God, Giorgio, who has caused you to serve Duke Cosimo, who, in his contentment that you should build and paint and carry into execution his conceptions and designs, has grudged no expense, and you will remember, if you consider it, that the others whose lives you have written did not have such advantages. With most honorable obsequies, and with the concourse of all the craftsmen, all his friends, and all the Florentine colony, Michelangelo was given burial in a sepulchre at St. Apostolo, in the sight of all Rome, His Holiness having intended to make him some particular memorial and tomb in St. Pietro at Rome. Leonardo, his nephew, arrived when all was over, although he traveled post. When Duke Cosimo was informed of the event, he confirmed his resolve that since he had not been able to have him and honor him alive, he would have him brought to Florence and not hesitate to honor him with all manner of pomp after death. And the body was sent secretly in a bale under the title of merchandise, which method was adopted lest there might be a tumult in Rome, and lest perchance the body of Michelangelo might be detained and prevented from leaving Rome for Florence. But before the body arrived, the news of the death having been heard, the principal painters, sculptors, and architects were assembled together at the summons of the lieutenant of their academy, and they were reminded by that lieutenant, who at that time was the Reverend Don Vincenzo Borghini, that they were obliged by virtue of their statutes to pay due honor to the death of any of their brethren, and that, they having done this so lovingly, and with such universal satisfaction in the obsequies of Fra Giovanni Agnola Montesolo, who had been the first to die after the creation of the Academy, that they should look well to what it might be proper for them to do in honor of Buonarroti, who had been elected by a unanimous vote of the whole body of the company as the first academician and the head of them all, to which proposal they all replied, as men most deeply indebted and affected to the genius of so great a man, that at all costs pains should be taken to do him honor in the best and finest ways available to them. This done, in order not to have to assemble so many persons together every day, to their great inconvenience, and to the end that matters might proceed more quietly. 4 men were elected as heads of the obsequies and the funeral pomp that were to be held. The painters Agnolio Bronzino and Giorgio Vasari, and the sculptors Benvenuto Cellini and Bartolomeo and Menotti, all men of illustrious name and eminent ability in their arts, to the end, I say, that they might consult and determine between themselves and the lieutenant what was to be done in each particular, and in what way, with authority and power to dispose of the whole body of the company and academy. This charge they accepted all the more willingly because all the members, young and old, each of his own profession, offered their services for the execution of such pictures and statues as had to be done for that funeral pomp. They then ordained that the lieutenant, in pursuance of his office, and the consuls, in the name of the company and academy, should lay the whole matter before the Lord Duke, and beseech him for all the aids and favors that might be necessary, and especially for permission to have those obsequies held in St. Lorenzo, the church of the most illustrious house of Medici, wherein are the greater part of the works by the hand of Michelangelo, that there are to be seen in Florence, and, in addition, that His Excellency should allow Messer Benedetto Varchi to compose and deliver the funeral oration, to the end that the excellent genius of Michelangelo might be extolled by the rare eloquence of a man so great as was Varchi, who, being in the particular service of His Excellency, would not have undertaken such a charge without a word from him, although they were very certain that, as one most loving by nature and deeply affected to the memory of Michelangelo, of himself he would never have refused. This done, and the academicians dismissed, the above-named lieutenant wrote to the Lord Duke a letter of his precise tenor. The Academy and company of painters and sculptors, having resolved among themselves, if it should please your most illustrious Excellency, to do honor in some sort of the memory of Michelangelo Buonarroti, both from the general obligation due from their profession to the extraordinary genius of one who was perhaps the greatest craftsman who has ever lived, and from their particular obligation through their belonging to a common country, and also because of the great advantage that these professions have received from the perfection of his works and inventions, insomuch that they hold themselves obliged to prove their affection to his genius in whatever way they are able. They have laid this, their desire, before your illustrious Excellency in a letter, and have besought you, as their peculiar refuge, for a certain measure of assistance. I, entreated by them, and being, as I think, obliged because your most illustrious Excellency has been content that I should be again this year in their company, with the title of your lieutenant, with the added reason that the proposal is a generous one and worthy of virtuous and grateful minds. And above all, knowing how your most illustrious Excellency is the patron of talent, and as it were a haven and unique protector for ingenious persons in this age, even surpassing in this respect your forefathers, who bestowed extraordinary favors on those excellent in these professions, as by order of the magnificent Lorenzo, Giotto, already so long dead, received a statue in the principal church, and Fra Filippo, a most beautiful tomb of marble at his expense, while many others obtained the greatest benefits and honors on various occasions. Moved, I say, by all these reasons, I have taken upon myself to recommend to your most illustrious Excellency the petition of this Academy, that they may be able to honor the genius of Michelangelo, the particular nursling and pupil of the school of the magnificent Lorenzo, which will be an extraordinary pleasure to them, a vast satisfaction to men in general, no small incitement to the professors of these arts, and to all Italy a proof of the lofty mind and overflowing goodness of your most illustrious excellency, whom may God long preserve in happiness for the benefit of your people and the support of every talent. To which letter the above-named Lord Duke answered thus: Reverend and well-beloved friend, the zeal that this Academy has displayed and continues to display to honor the memory of Michelangelo Buonarroti, who has passed from this to a better life, has given us much consolation for the loss of a man so extraordinary, and we wish not only to satisfy them in all that they have demanded in their memorial, but also to have his remains brought to Florence, which, according as we are informed, was his own desire. All this we are writing to the aforesaid Academy to encourage them to celebrate by every possible means the genius of that great man. May God content you in your desire. Of the letter, or rather memorial, of which mention has been made above, addressed by the Academy to the Lord Duke, the tenor was as follows: Most illustrious, etc. The Academy and the men of the Company of Design, created by the grace and favor of your most illustrious excellency, knowing with what solicitude and affection you caused the body of Michelangelo Buonarroti to be brought to Florence by means of your representative in Rome, have assembled together and have unanimously determined that they shall celebrate his obsequies in the best manner in their power and knowledge. Wherefore they, knowing that your most illustrious excellency was revered by him, as much as you yourself loved him, beseech you that you should deign in your infinite goodness and liberality to grant to them, first, that they may be allowed to celebrate the said obsequies in the Church of St. Lorenzo, a church built by your ancestors, in which are so many beautiful works wrought by his hand, both in architecture and in sculpture, and near which you are minded to have erected a place that shall be, as it were, a nest in an abiding school of architecture, sculpture, and painting for the above-named Academy and Company of Design. Secondly, they pray you that you should consent to grant a commission to Messer Benedetto Varchi, that he shall not only compose the funeral oration, but also deliver it with his own mouth, as he has promised most freely that he would do, when besought by us, in the event of your most illustrious excellency consenting. In the third place, they entreat and pray you that you should deign, in the same goodness and liberality of your heart, to supply them with all that may be necessary for them in celebrating the above-mentioned obsequies, over and above their own resources, which are very small. All these matters, and each singly, have been discussed and determined in the presence and with the consent of the most magnificent and reverend Monsignor, Messer Vincenzio Borghini, Prior of the Innocenti and Lieutenant of your most illustrious excellency in the aforesaid Academy and Company of Design, which, etc. To which the letter of the Academy, the Duke made this reply: Well, beloved academicians, we are well content to give full satisfaction to your petitions. So great is the affection that we have always borne to the rare genius of Michelangelo Buonarroti, and that we still bear to all your profession. Do not hesitate, therefore, to carry out all that you have proposed to do in his obsequies, for we will not fail to supply whatever you need. Meanwhile, we have written to Messer Benedetto Varchi in the matter of the oration, and to the director of the hospital, with regard to anything more that may be necessary in this undertaking. Fare ye well. Pisa. The letter to Varchi was as follows: Messer Benedetto, our well-beloved, the affection that we bear to the rare genius of Michelangelo Buonarroti makes us desire that his memory should be honored and celebrated in every possible way. It will be pleasing to us, therefore, that you, for love of us, shall undertake the charge of composing the oration that is to be delivered at his obsequies, according to the arrangements made by the deputies of the Academy, and still more pleasing that it should be delivered by your own lips, Fare you well. Messer Bernardini Grazzini also wrote to the above-named deputies that they could not have expected in the Duke any desire in that matter more ardent than that which he had shown, and that they might be assured of every aid and favor from his most illustrious excellency. While these matters were being discussed in Florence, Leonardo Buonarroti, Michelangelo's nephew, who, when informed of his uncle's illness, had made his way to Rome by post, but had not found him alive. Having heard from Daniele da Volterra, who had been the very familiar friend of Michelangelo, and also from others who had been about the person of that saintly old man, that he had requested and prayed that his body should be carried to Florence, the most noble city of his birth, of which he was always a most tender lover. Leonardo, I say, with prompt and therefore good resolution, removed the body cautiously from Rome and sent it off to Florence in a bale, as if it had been a piece of merchandise. And here I must not omit to say that this final resolution of Michelangelo's proved a thing against the opinion of certain persons, but nevertheless very true, namely, that his absence for so many years from Florence had been caused by no other thing but the nature of the air, for the reason that experience had taught him that the air of Florence, being sharp and subtle, was very injurious to his constitution, while that of Rome, softer and more temperate, had kept him in perfect health up to his 90th year, with all the senses as lively and sound as they had ever been, and with such strength for his age that up to the last day he had never ceased to work at something. Since then, the coming of the bale was so sudden and so unexpected that for the time being it was not possible to do what was done afterwards. The body of Michelangelo, on arriving in Florence, was placed with the coffin at the desire of the deputies, on the same day that it arrived in the city, namely on the 11th of March, which was a Saturday, in the company of the Assumption, which is under the high altar of St. Pietro Maggiore, beneath the steps at the back. But it was not touched in any way whatever. The next day, which was Sunday of the second week in Lent, all the painters, sculptors, and architects assembled as quietly as possible round St. Pietro, whither they had brought nothing but a pall of velvet, all bordered and embroidered in gold, which covered the coffin and the whole bier, upon which coffin was an image of Christ crucified. Then, about the middle hour of the night, all having gathered around the body, all at once the oldest and most eminent craftsmen laid their hands on a great quantity of torches that had been carried there, and the younger men took up the bier with such eagerness that blessed was he who would approach it and place his shoulders under it, believing, as it were, that in the time to come they would be able to claim the glory of having borne the remains of the greatest man that had ever been in their arts. The sight of a certain number of persons assembled about St. Pietro had caused, as always happens in such cases, many others to stop there, and the rather as it had been trumpeted abroad that the body of Michelangelo had arrived, and was to be carried to St. Croce. And although, as I have said, every precaution had been taken that the matter should not become known, lest the report might spread through the city, and there might flock thither such a multitude that it would not be possible to avoid a certain degree of tumult and confusion, and also because they desired that the little which they wished to do at that time should be done with more quiet than pomp, reserving the rest for a more convenient time with greater leisure. Nevertheless, both the one thing and the other took a contrary course, for with regard to the multitude, the news, as has been related, passing from lip to lip, in the twinkling of eye, the church was so filled that in the end it was with the greatest difficulty that the body was carried from the church to the sacristy, in order to take it out of the bale and then place it in the sepulchre. With regard to the question of honor, although it cannot be denied that to see in funeral pomps a great show of priests, a large quantity of wax tapers, and a great number of mourners dressed in black, is a thing of grand and magnificent appearance, it does not follow that it was not also a great thing to see thus assembled in a small company, without preparation, all those eminent men who are now in such repute, and who will be even more in the future, honoring that body with such loving and affectionate offices. And, in truth, the number of such craftsmen in Florence, and they were all there, has always been very great, for the reason that these arts have always flourished in Florence in such a manner, that I believe that it may be said without prejudice to other cities, that their principal and true nest and domicile is Florence, not otherwise than Athens once was of the sciences. In addition to that number of craftsmen, there were so many citizens following them, and so many at the sides of the streets where the procession passed, that there was no place for any more. And, what is an even greater thing, there was nothing heard but praises in every man's mouth of the merits of Michelangelo, all saying the true genius has such force that, after all expectation of such honor and profit as can be obtained from a gifted man has failed, nevertheless, by its own nature and peculiar merits, it remains honored and beloved. For these reasons, that demonstration was more vivid in effect and more precious than any pomp of gold and trappings that could have been contrived. The body having been carried with so beautiful a train into St. Croce, after the friars had finished the ceremonies that were customary for the dead, it was borne, not without very great difficulty, as has been related, by reason of the concourse of people, into the sacristy, where the above-named lieutenant, who had been present in virtue of his office, thinking to do a thing pleasing to many, and also, as he afterwards confessed, desiring to see in death one whom he had not seen in life, or had seen at such an early age that he had lost all memory of him, then resolved to have the coffin opened. This done, when he and all the rest of us present thought to find the body already marred and putrefied, because Michelangelo had been dead 25 days and 22 in the coffin. We found it so perfect in every part, and so free from any noisome odor, that we were ready to believe that it was rather at rest in a sweet and most peaceful sleep. And, besides that, the features of the face were exactly as in life, except that there was something of the color of death. It had no member that was marred or revealed any corruption, and the head and cheeks were not otherwise to the touch than as if he had passed away but a few hours before. When the tumult of the people had abated, arrangements were made to place the body in a sepulchre in the church beside the altar of the Cavalcanti, by the door that leads into the cloister of the chapter house. Meanwhile the news had spread through the city, and such a multitude of young people flocked thither to see the corpse, that there was great difficulty in contriving to close the tomb, and if it had been day instead of night, we would have been forced to leave it open many hours in order to satisfy the public. The following morning, while the painters and sculptors were commencing to make arrangements for the memorial of honor, many choice spirits, such as have always abounded in Florence, began to attach the above aforesaid sepulchral verses both Latin and in the vulgar tongue, and so it was continued for some time. But those compositions that were printed at the time were but a small part with respect to the many that were written. Now to come to the obsequies, which were not held the day after the day of St. John, as had been intended, but were postponed until the 14th of July. The three deputies, for Benvenuto Cellini, having felt somewhat indisposed from the beginning, had never taken any part in the matter, having appointed the sculptors Zanobi, Lastricati, as their proveditor, resolved that they would do something ingenious and worthy of their arts, rather than costly and full of pomp, And in truth, since honor was to be paid, said those deputies and their proveditors, to such a man as Michelangelo, and by men of the profession that he had practiced, men rich rather in talents than in excess of means, that must be done not with regal pomp or superfluous vanities, but with inventions and works abounding in spirit and loveliness, such an issue from the knowledge and readiness of hand of our craftsmen, thus honoring art with art. For although, they said, we may expect from His Excellency the Lord Duke any sum of money that may be necessary, and we have already received such amounts as we have demanded, nevertheless, we must hold it as certain that from us there is expected something ingenious and pleasing in invention and art, rather than rich through vast expense or grand by reason of superb appurtenances. But, notwithstanding this, it was seen in the end that the work was equal in magnificence to any that ever issued from the hands of those academicians, and that this memorial of honor was no less truly magnificent than it was ingenious and full of fanciful and praiseworthy inventions. Finally, then, it was arranged that in the central nave of St. Lorenzo, between the two lateral doors, up which one leads out of the church and the other into the cloister, there should be erected, as was done, a catafalque of a rectangular form, 28 braccia high, 11 braccia long, and 9 broad, with a figure of fame on the summit. On the base of the catafalque, which rose 2 braccia from the ground, on the part looking towards the principal door of the church, there were placed 2 most beautiful recumbent figures of rivers, one representing the Arno and the other the Tiber. Arno had a horn of plenty, full of flowers and fruits, signifying thereby the fruits that have come to these professions from the city of Florence, which have been of such a kind and so many that they have filled the world, and particularly Rome, with extraordinary beauty. This was demonstrated excellently well by the other river, representing, as has been said, the Tiber, in that, extending one arm, it had the hands full of flowers and fruits received from the horn of plenty of the Arno, which lay beside it, face to face. And it served also to demonstrate, by enjoying the fruits of Arno, that Michelangelo had lived a great part of his life in Rome, and had executed there those marvelous that cause amazement to the world. Arno had for a sign the lion, and Tiber the she-wolf, with the infants Romulus and Remus, and they were both colossal figures of extraordinary grandeur and beauty, in the likeness of marble. One, the Tiber, was by the hand of Giovanni di Benedetto of Castello, a pupil of Bandinelli, and the other by Battista di Benedetto, a pupil of Amalati, both excellent young men of the highest promise. From this level rose facades of 5 braccia and a half, with the proper cornices above and below, and also at the corners, leaving space for 4 pictures, one in the center of each. In the first of these, which was on the facade, where the 2 rivers were, there was painted in chiaroscuro, as were also all the other pictures of this structure, the magnificent Lorenzo de' Medici, the elder, receiving Michelangelo as a boy in his garden, of which there has been an account in another place, after he had seen certain specimens of his handiwork, which foreshadowed, as early flowers, the fruits that afterwards issued in abundance from the living force and grandeur of his genius. Such, then, was the story contained in that picture, which was painted by Mirabello and Girolamo del Grossefacio, so called, who, as very dear friends and companions, undertook to do the work together. In it were animated and lively attitudes, and there could be seen the above-named magnificent Lorenzo, portrayed from nature, graciously receiving Michelangelo, a boy all full of reverence, into his garden, and, after an examination, handing it over to some masters who should teach him. In the second scene, which came, continuing the same order, To face towards the lateral door that leads out of the church was figured Pope Clement, who, contrary to the expectation of the public, was thought that His Holiness felt a stain against Michelangelo on account of his actions in the siege of Florence, not only assures his safety and shows himself lovingly disposed towards him, but sets him to work on the new sacristy and the library of St. Lorenzo, in which places how divinely well he worked has already been told. In this picture, then, it was painted by the hand of Federico Fiammingo, called Del Padovano, with much dexterity and great sweetness of manner, Michelangelo showing to the Pope the ground plan of that sacristy, and behind him were borne, partly by little angels and partly by other figures, the models of the library and sacristy and of the statues that are there, finished at the present day, which was all very well composed and executed with diligence. In the third picture, which stood on the first level, like the others described above, and looked towards the high altar, was a great Latin epitaph composed by the most learned Monsieur Peter Vittori, the sense of which was in the Florentine speech as follows. The Academy of Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, with the favor and assistance of Duke Cosimo de' Medici, their head and the supreme protector of these arts, admiring the extraordinary genius of Michelangelo Buonarroti, and seeking to acknowledge in part the benefits received from his divine works, has dedicated this memorial, born from their own hands and from all the affection of their hearts, to the excellence and genius of the greatest painter, sculptor, and architect that there has ever been. The Latin words were these: Collegium Pictorum, Statuarium, Architecturium, Auspicio opec sibi prompto Cosimo Ducis Octorus, Suram Comoratum, Suspiciens Singularum Virtutum Michelangelis Angeli Buonarroti, Intelligence quanto sibi auxilio semper furent preclara ipsius opera, studiat de gratum erga illum ostendere, sunum omnium qui uncum figurunt, PSA, idioc, momentum, hoc suis manibus extratum, magnum animi, adori, ipsius memorii dedicavit. This epitaph was supported by two little angels, who, with weeping faces, and extinguishing each a torch, appeared to be lamenting that a genius so great and so rare was now spent. Next, in the picture which came to face towards the door that leads into the cloister, was Michelangelo making, on account of the siege of Florence, the fortifications of the hill of San Miniato, which were held to be impregnable and a marvelous work. This was by the hand of Lorenzo Sciorrini, a pupil of Bronzino, and a young man of excellent promise. This lowest part, or so to speak, the base of the whole structure, had at every corner a pedestal that projected, and upon every pedestal was a statue larger than life, which had beneath it another, as it were subjugated and vanquished, of similar size, but each constrained in a different and extravagant attitude. The first, on the right hand going towards the high altar, was a young man, slender in the very presentment of pure spirit, and of a most lively beauty, representing genius, with two little wings over the temples, in the guise wherein at times Mercury is painted. And beneath this young man, wrought with incredible diligence, was a marvelous figure with ass's ears, representing ignorance, the mortal enemy of genius. These two statues were by the hand of Vincenzo Danti of Perugia, of whom and of his works, which are renowned among the young modern sculptors, we shall speak at greater length in another place. Upon the next pedestal, which, being on the right hand of the approach towards the high altar, looked towards the new sacristy, was a woman representing Christian piety, which, being composed of religion and every other excellence, is nothing less than an aggregate of all those virtues that we have called the theological and of those that were named by the Gentiles the moral. Wherefore, it was right that, since the genius of a Christian, adorned by most saintly character, was being celebrated by Christians, a seemly and honorable place should be given to this piety, which is concerned with the law of God and the salvation of souls, seeing that all other ornaments of body and mind, which she is lacking, are to be held in little estimation, or rather none. This figure, who had beneath her, prostrate and trampled underfoot by her vice, or rather impiety, was by the hand of Valerio Gioli, who is a young man of ability and fine spirit, and deserves the name of a very judicious and diligent sculptor. Opposite to this, on the side towards the old sacristy, was another similar figure made with much judgment to represent Minerva, or rather, art, for the reason that it may be said with truth that after excellence of character in life, which must always hold the first place among the good, it was art that gave to this man not only honor and profit, but also so much glory, that he may be said to have enjoyed in his lifetime such fruits as able and illustrious men have great difficulty in wresting, even after death, from the grasp of fame, by means of their finest works, and, what is more, that he so vanquished envy, that by common consent, without any contradiction, he has obtained the rank and fame of the best and highest excellence. And for this reason this figure had beneath her feet Envy, who was an old woman, lean and withered, with the eyes of a viper, in short, with features that all breathed out venom and poison, besides which she was girt with serpents, and had a viper in her hand. These two statues were by the hand of a boy of very tender years, called Lazzaro Calamek of Carrara, who at the present day, although still a mere lad, has given in some works of painting and sculpture convincing proofs of a beautiful and most lively genius. By the hand of Andrea Calamek, the uncle of the above-mentioned Lazzaro, and pupil of Aminati, were the two statues placed upon the fourth pedestal, which was opposite to the organ and looked towards the principal doors of the church. The first of these was made to represent study, for the reason that those who exert themselves little and sluggishly can never acquire repute, as Michelangelo did, who from his early boyhood, from 15 to 90 years of age, has been seen above, never ceased to labor. This statue of study, which was well in keeping with that great man, was a bold and vigorous youth, who had at the end of the arms, just above the joint of the hands, two little wings signifying rapidity and frequency of working, and he had prostrate beneath him, as a prisoner, idleness or indolence, who was a sluggish and weary woman, heavy and somnolent in her whole attitude. These four figures, disposed in the manner that has been described, made a very handsome and magnificent composition, and had all the appearance of marble, because a coat of white had been laid over the clay, which resulted in a very beautiful effect. From this level, upon which the above-named figures rested, there rose another base, likewise rectangular and about 4 brachia high, but smaller in length and breadth than that below by the extent of the projection and cornice work upon which those figures rested. And on every side, this had a painted compartment 6 brachia and a half in length, and 3 in height. Above this rose a platform in the same manner as that below, but smaller, and upon every corner, on the projection of a socle, sat a figure of the size of life, or rather more. These were 4 women who, from the instruments that they had, were easily recognized as painting, sculpture, architecture, and poetry, placed there for reasons that have been perceived in the narration of Michelangelo's life. Now going from the principal door of the church towards the high altar, in the first picture of the second range of the catafalque, namely, above the scene in which, as has been related, Lorenzo de' Medici is receiving Michelangelo into his garden, there was painted in a most beautiful manner, to suggest architecture. Michelangelo in the presence of Pope Pius IV, with a model in his hands of the stupendous pile of the cupola of St. Pietro in Rome. This scene, which was much extolled, was painted by Piero Francia, a Florentine painter, with beautiful manner and invention, and the statue, or rather, image of architecture, which was on the left hand of this scene, was by the hand of Giovanni di Benedetto of Castello, who, with so much credit to himself, as has been related, executed also the Tiber, one of the two rivers that were on the front part of the catafalque. In the second picture, continuing to go forward on the right hand towards the lateral door that leads out of the church, was seen to suggest painting. Michelangelo painting that so much, but never sufficiently extolled judgment. That judgment, I mean, which was an exemplar in foreshortenings and all the other difficulties of art. This picture, which was executed by Michel di Rodolfo's young men with much diligence and grace, had likewise, on the left hand, namely at the corner looking towards the new sacristy, its appropriate image, a statue of painting, wrought by Battista del Cavaliere, a young man no less excellent in sculpture than remarkable for his goodness, modesty, and character. In the third picture, facing towards the high altar, in that namely, which was above the epitaph already mentioned, there was to be seen to suggest sculpture. Michelangelo speaking with a woman, who by many signs could be recognized as sculpture, and it appeared that he was making counsel with her. Michelangelo had about him some of the most excellent works that he executed in sculpture, and the woman held a little tablet with these words of Boethius, simili sub imagine formans. Beside that picture, which was the work of Andrea del Minga, and executed by him with beautiful invention and manner, there was on the left hand the statue of sculpture, wrought very well by the sculptor Antonio de Gino Lorenzi. In the fourth of those four scenes, which faced towards the organ, there could be seen to suggest poetry, Michelangelo all intent on writing some composition, and about him the 9 muses, marvelous in their grace and beauty, and with their distinctive garments, according as they are described by the poets, and before them Apollo with the lyre in his hand, his crown of laurel on his head, and another crown in the hand, which he made as if to place on the head of Michelangelo. Near the gladsome and beautiful composition of this scene, painted in a very lovely manner, with most vivacious and spirited attitudes by Giovanni Maria Botteri, there was on the left hand the statue of poetry, the work of Domenico Puccini, a man much practiced not only in sculpture and in striking impressions of coins and metals with great beauty, but also in working in bronze and likewise in poetry. Of such a kind, then, was the ornamentation of the catafalque, which so diminished from course to course that it was possible to walk round each, and it was much after the likeness of the mausoleum of Augustus in Rome, although, perchance, from being rectangular, it rather resembled the Septensorium of Severus, not that near the Campidoglio, which is commonly so called in error, but the true one, which is to be seen in stamp in the Nuovo of Rome, near the baths of Antoninus. Up to this point, the catafalque had 3 levels, where the ribbers lay was the first, the second where the pairs of figures rested, and the third where the single figures had their feet. From this last level rose a base, or rather socle, 1 braccio high, and much less in length and breadth than that last level. Upon the projections of that base sat the above-named single figures, and around it could be read these words, Sic ar extoliatur arti. Upon this base stood a pyramid 9 braccia high, on 2 sides of which, namely, that which looked towards the principal door, and that which faced towards the high altar, at the foot, were 2 ovals with the head of Michelangelo portrayed from nature, in relief, and executed very well by Santi Buglioni. At the summit of the pyramid was a ball in due proportion with the pyramid. such as might have contained the ashes of him who was being honored. And upon the ball was the figure of Fame, larger than life and in the likeness of marble, and in the act, as it were, of taking flight, and at the same time of causing the praises and glories of that great craftsman to resound throughout the world, through a trumpet which branched into 3 mouths. That fame was by the hand of Zanobi Lastricati, who, besides the labors that he had as proveditor for the whole work, desired also not to fail to show, with much honor to himself, the virtue of his hand and brain, in all, from the level of the ground to the head of the fame. The height, as has been related, was 28 brachia. Besides the catafalque described above, the whole church was draped with black baize and serge, hung not on the columns in the center, as is usual, but on the chapels that are all around. And there was no space between the pilasters that enclosed those chapels and correspond to the columns, that had not some adornment in painting, which, making ingenious, pleasing, and beautiful display, caused marvel and at the same time the greatest delight. Now, to begin with one end, in the space of the first chapel that is beside the high altar, as you go towards the old sacristy, was a picture 6 braccia in height and 8 in length, in which, with novel, as it were, poetical invention, was Michelangelo in the center, already come to the Elysian fields, where, on his right hand, were figures considerably larger than life of the most famous and most highly celebrated sculptors and painters of antiquity. Each of these could be recognized by some notable sign. Praxiteles, by the satyr, that is in the figure of Pope Julius III. Apelles, by the portrait of Alexander the Great. Susius, by a little panel in which were figured the grapes that deceived the birds. And Parhosus, with the covering counterfeited in painting over his picture. And even as these, so the others were known by other signs. On the left hand were those who have been illustrious in these arts in our own centuries, from Cimabue to the present day. Thus Giotto could be recognized there by a little panel on which was seen the portrait of Dante as a young man, in the manner in which he may be seen in St. Croce, painted by Giotto himself. Masaccio, by his portrait from life. Donatello, likewise by his portrait, and also by his Zucconi from the Campanile, which was by his side, and Filippo Brunelleschi, by the representation of his cupola of St. Maria del Fiore, and they were portrayed from life without other signs, Fra Filippo, Taddeo Gaddi, Paolo Uccello, Fra Giovanni Agnoli, Jacopo da Portormo, Francesco Salviato, and others. All these were about him with the same expressions of welcome as the ancients, full of love and admiration, in the same manner as Virgil was received by the other poets on his return, according to the fable of the divine poet Dante, from whom, in addition to the invention, there was taken also the verse that could be read in a scroll, both above and in the hand of the river Arno, which lay at the feet of Michelangelo, most beautiful in features and in attitude. Tutti Lamerin, tutti orno glyphano. This picture by the hand of Alessandro Allori, the pupil of Bronzino. An excellent painter and a not unworthy disciple and pupil of so great a master, was consummately extolled by all those who saw it. In the space of the chapel of the Most Holy Sacrament, at the head of the transept, there was in a picture 5 brachii in length and 4 in breadth. Michelangelo with all the school of the arts about him, little children, boys, and young men of every age up to 24, who were offering to him, as to a being sacred and divine, the first fruits of their labors, such as pictures, sculptures, and models, and he was receiving them courteously, and was instructing them in the matters of art, while they were listening most intently, and gazing upon him with expressions and attitudes truly full of beauty and grace. And, to tell the truth, the whole composition of this picture could not have been, in a certain sense, better done, nor could anything more beautiful have been desired in any of the figures. Wherefore Battista, the pupil of Portormo, who had done the work, received infinite praise for it, and the verses that were to be read at the foot of the scene ran thus: Tu pater, tu referum inventor, tu patria nobis, sapeditas, precepta tuus ex, inclite chartis. Going then from the place where the picture described above, towards the principal doors of the church, almost at the corner and just before arriving at the organ, in a picture 6 braccia long and 4 high, that was in the space of a chapel, there was depicted the extraordinary and unexampled favor that was paid to the rare genius of Michelangelo by Pope Julius III, who, wishing to avail himself in a certain buildings of the judgment of that great man, had him summoned to his presence at his villa, where, having invited him to sit by his side, they talked a good time together, while cardinals, bishops, and other personages of the court, whom they had about them, remained constantly standing. This event, I say, was seen to have been depicted with such fine composition and so much relief, and with such liveliness and spirit in the figures, that perchance it might not have turned out better from the hands of an eminent, aged, and well-practiced master, wherefore Jacopo Zucchi, a young man, the pupil of Giorgio Vasari, who executed the work in a beautiful manner, proved that a most honorable result could be expected from him. Not far from this, on the same side, namely a little below the organ, Giovanni Strada, an able Flemish painter, had depicted in a picture, 6 braccia long and 4 high, the story of Michelangelo's going to Venice at the time of the siege of Florence, where, living in that quarter of that most noble city, which is called the Giudica, the Doge Andrea Gritti and the Signoria sent some gentlemen and others to visit him and make him very great offers. In representing that event, the above-named painter showed great judgment and much knowledge, which did him great honor, both in the whole composition and in every part of it. For in the attitudes, the lively expressions of the faces, and the movements of every figure, were seen invention, design, and excellent grace. Now, returning to the high altar, and facing towards the new sacristy, in the first picture found there, which came in the space of the first chapel, there was depicted by the hand of Santi Titti, a young man of most beautiful judgment and much practiced in painting, both in Florence and in Rome, another signal favor paid to the genius of Michelangelo, as I believed I mentioned above, by the most illustrious Lord Don Francesco de' Medici, Prince of Florence, who, happening to be in Rome about 3 years before Michelangelo died, and receiving a visit from him, the moment that Buonarroti entered, the prince rose to his feet, and then, in order to do honor to that great man, and to his truly venerable age, with the greatest courtesy that ever young prince showed, insisted, although Michelangelo, who was very modest, protested against it, that he should sit in his own chair, from which he had risen, standing afterwards on his feet, to hear him with the attention and reverence that children are wont to pay to a well-beloved father. At the feet of the prince was a boy, executed with great diligence, who had at his hands a mazzocchio, or ducal cap, and around them were some soldiers dressed in ancient fashion, and painted with much spirit and a beautiful manner, but beyond all the rest, most beautifully wrought, most lifelike and most natural, were the prince and Michelangelo, insomuch that it appeared as if the old man were in truth speaking, and the young man most intently listening to his words.
In another picture, 9 braccia in height and 12 in length, which was opposite to the Chapel of the Sacrament, Bernardo Timanti Buontalenti, a painter much beloved and favored by the most illustrious prince, had figured with most beautiful invention of the rivers of the 3 principal parts of the world, come, as it were, all grieving and sorrowful, to lament with Arno on their common loss and to console him. And these rivers were the Nile, the Ganges, and the Po. The Nile had as a symbol a crocodile, and to signify the fertility of his country, a garland of ears of corn. The Ganges, a griffin bird, and a chaplet of gems. The Po, a swan and a crown of black amber. These rivers, having been conducted into Tuscany by the Fame, who was to be seen on high, as it were in flight, were standing around Arno, who was crowned with cypress and held his vase, drained empty, uplifted with one hand, and in the other a branch of cypress, and beneath him was a lion. And to signify that the soul of Michelangelo had flown to the highest felicity in heaven, the judicious painter had depicted in the air a splendor, representing the celestial light towards which the blessed soul, in the form of an angel, was winging its way. With this lyric verse, Viviens orbe petto lobitus et terra. At the sides, upon two bases, were two figures in the act of holding open a curtain within which, so it appeared, were the above-named rivers, the soul of Michelangelo and the Fame, and each of these two figures had another beneath it. That which was on the right hand of the rivers, representing Vulcan, had a torch in the hand, and the figure representing hatred, which had the neck under Vulcan's heel in an attitude of great constraint, and as it were struggling to writhe free, had as a symbol a vulture, with this verse, Surgere quid prosperas odium crudele jacito. And that because things superhuman and almost divine should in no way be regarded with envy or hatred, the other representing Aglaea, one of the three graces and wife of Vulcan, to signify proportion, had in her hand a lily, both because flowers are dedicated to the graces, and also because the lily is held not to be inappropriate to the rites of death. The figure which was lying beneath Aglaea, and which was painted to represent disproportion, had as a symbol a monkey, or rather, ape, and above her this verse, Vivus et extinctus docuit sic sternera turpe. And under the rivers were these two other verses, Venimus aurine tuo confixa in vulnere mustra, flumina et eruptum mundo plorimus honorem. This picture was held to be very beautiful in the invention, in the composition of the whole scene, and of the loveliness of the figures, and in the beauty of the verses. And because the painter honored Michelangelo with his labor, not by commission, but spontaneously and with such assistance as his own merit enabled him to obtain from his courteous and honorable friends, and for this reason he deserved to be even more highly commended. In another picture, 6 braccia in length and 4 in height, near the lateral door that leads out of the church, Tommaso de San Friano, a young painter of much ability, had painted Michelangelo as ambassador of his country at the court of Pope Julius II. As we have related that he went, and for what reasons, sent by Soderini. Not far distant from the above-named picture, namely a little below that lateral door which leads out of the church, in another picture of the same size, Stefano Pieri, a pupil of Bronzino, and a young man of great diligence and industry, had painted a scene that had in truth happened several times in Rome not long before, namely, Michelangelo seated in a room by the side of the most illustrious Lord Duke Cosimo, who stood conversing with him. Of all which enough has been said above. Over the said black draperies with which, as has been told, the whole church was hung all round, wherever there were no painted scenes or pictures, there were in each of the spaces of the chapels images of death, devices, and other such-like things, all different from those that are generally made, and very fanciful and beautiful. Some of these, as it were, lamenting that they had been forced to deprive the world of such a man, had those words been in a scroll, cogiet dura necessitas. And near them was a globe of the world, from which had sprung a lily, which had 3 flowers and was broken in the middle, executed with most beautiful fantasy and invention by the above-named Alessandro Allori. There were other deaths, also depicted with other inventions, but that one was most extolled, upon whose neck, as she lay prostrate on the ground, Eternity, with a palm in the hand, had painted one of her feet, and regarding her with a look of disdain, appeared to be saying to her, "Be it necessity or thy will, thou hast done nothing, for in spite of thee, come what may, Michelangelo shall live." The motto ran thus: Vicit inclita virtus, and all this was the invention of Vasari. I will not omit to say that each of these deaths had on either side of the device of Michelangelo, which has 3 crowns, or rather 3 circlets, intertwined together in such a manner that the circumference of one passed through the center of the others, and so with each, which sign Michelangelo used either to suggest that the 3 professions of sculpture, painting, and architecture are interwoven with one another, and so bound together that each of them receives benefit and adornment from the others, and they neither can nor should be separated. Or, indeed, being a man of lofty genius, he may have had more subtle meaning. But the academicians, considering him to have been perfect in all these 3 professions, and that each of these had assisted and embellished the other, changed his 3 circlets into 3 crowns, intertwined together with the motto Tergiminus tollet honoribus, which was intended to signify that in those 3 professions the crown of human perfection was justly due to him. On the pulpit from which Verci delivered the funeral oration, which was afterwards printed, there is no ornamentation, because that work having been executed in bronze, with scenes in half-relief and low relief by the excellent Donatello, any ornament that might have been added to it would have been, by a great measure, less beautiful. But on the other, which is opposite to the first, although it had not yet been raised on columns, there was a picture 4 braccia in height, and little more than 2 in width, wherein there is painted with beautiful invention and excellent design to represent fame, or rather honor, a young man in a most beautiful attitude, with a trumpet in the right hand, and with the feet planted on time and death, in order to show that fame and honor, in spite of death and time, preserve alive to all eternity those who have labored valiantly in his life. This picture was by the hand of Vincenzo Dante, the sculptor of Perugia, of whom we have spoken and will speak again elsewhere. The church, having been embellished in such a manner, adorned with lights, and filled with a countless multitude, for everyone had left every other care and flocked together to such an honorable spectacle, there entered behind the above-named lieutenant of the academy, accompanied by captain and halberdiers of the Duke's Guard, the consuls and the academicians, and in short all the painters, sculptors, and architects of Florence. After all these had sat down between the catafalque and the high altar, where they had been awaited for a good while by an infinite number of lords and gentlemen who had been accommodated with seats according to the rank of each, there was begun a most solemn mass for the dead, with music and ceremonies of every kind. When finished, Varchi mounted the above-mentioned pulpit, who had never performed such an office since he did it for the most illustrious Lady Duchess of Ferrara, the daughter of Duke Cosimo. And there, with that elegance, those modes of utterance, and that voice, which were the peculiar attributes of that great man in oratory, he recounted the praises and merits, life and works of the divine Michelangelo Buonarroti. Of a truth, what great good fortune it was for Michelangelo that he did not die before our Academy was created, whereby his funeral rites were celebrated with so much honor and such magnificence and honorable pomp. So also it must be considered most fortunate for him that it happened that he passed from this to an eternal and most blessed life before Varchi, seeing that he could not have been extolled by any more eloquent and learned man. That funeral oration by Benedetto Varchi was printed for a short time afterward, as was also, not long after, that another equally beautiful oration, likewise in praise of Michelangelo and of painting, composed by the most noble and most learned Leonardo Salviati, at that time a young man of about 22 years of age, and of a rare and happy genius in all manners of composition, both Latin and Tuscan, as is known even now, and will be better known in the future to all the world. And what shall I say, what can I say, that would not be too little of the capacity, goodness, and wisdom of the most reverend Lord Lieutenant, the above-named Don Vincenzo Borghini, save that it was within him, as their chief, their pride, and their counselor, that the most eminent men of the Academy and Company of Design celebrated those obsequies, for the reason that, although each of them was competent to do much more in his art than he did, nevertheless no enterprise is ever carried to a perfect and praiseworthy end, save when one single man, in the manner of an experienced pilot and captain, has authority and power over all others. And since it was not possible that the whole city should see that funeral pomp in one day, by order of the Duke, it was all left standing many weeks for the satisfaction of his people and of the strangers who came from neighboring places to see it. We shall not give in this place the great multitude of epitaphs and verses, both Latin and Tuscan, composed by many able men in honor of Michelangelo, both because they would require a work to themselves, and because they have been written down and published by other writers elsewhere. But I will not omit to say in this last part that after all the honors described above, the Duke ordained that an honorable place should be given to Michelangelo for his tomb in San Croce, in which church he had proposed in his lifetime to be buried, because the sepulchre of his ancestors was there. And to Leonardo, the nephew of Michelangelo, His Excellency gave all the marbles, both white and variegated, for that tomb, which was allotted to Battista Lorenzi, an able sculptor, to execute after the design of Giorgio Vasari, together with the head of Michelangelo. And since there are to be 3 statues there, painting, sculpture, and architect, one of these was allotted to the above-named Battista, one to Giovanni dell'Opera, and the last to Valerio Cioli, Florentine sculptors, which statues are in process of being fashioned together with the tomb, and soon they will be finished and set in their places. The cost, over and above the marvels received from the Duke, has been borne by the same Leonardo Buonarroti, but His Excellency, in order not to fail in any respect in doing honor to that great man, will cause to be placed in the Duomo, as he had previously thought to do, a memorial with his name besides the head, even as there are to be seen there the names and images of other eminent Florentines.